Nice to see all of you. I'm deciding to do the lectures on chapter 11 and 12. I skipped over some of the other chapters, especially the ones that were just kind of repeating Immanuel Kant and respective persons. And then, of course, the last chapter, which just kind of summarizes our book. I wanted to focus on 11 and 12 because those are dealing with actual theories. One, feminism, and the other one, virtue ethics. And I just wanted to briefly just kind of go over both of those two theories with you today. So let's talk about the first one. Let's talk about feminism and the ethics of care. And it starts with a quote by Virginia Woolf, and she says, "It is obvious that the values of women differ very often from the values which have been made by the other sex, that is, men. Naturally, this is so, yet it is the masculine veils that prevail." And that's Virginia Woolf, and she wrote that in 1929. So Woolf kind of sets the stone for what we'll be talking about in this lecture. She kind of noticed that there are main differences between men and women, but women have been treated as secondary citizens for their differences and not valued for having these particular differences. So a lot of psychological research that has been done over the past 80, 70s, or 80 years has, somewhat proven that there are biological, social, economic, and genetic differences between the sexes. And that's not to say that that one is better than the other. If anything, one completes the other. And I think, regardless of what certain fields may say about just focusing on the similarities, I do think that when you focus on the distinction between the sexes, it actually bring some clarity and even insight to some of the ethical dilemmas that we may have. And so Woolf's quote was very penetrating, because what she's saying is that women, for their differences, for seeing, say, for example, care or virtue, their ability to see virtue in an altruistic way has been subsumed or assumed to be less than the logical reasoning from a male, and especially when it comes to ethical dilemmas. And you kind of see this when you turn to the page 147 and you read about Kohlberg. Kohlberg had various stages in his moral development. He believed in six main stages. The first stage, he believed that people just basically obeyed authority and avoided punishment. So stage one is really where you would have a lot of infants up until about 7 or 8 years old. But not just infants, as far as not just children, but maybe even people who have never really thought beyond their own particular tribe or family. And so people who are in a childlike phase, especially in stage one, only want to just kind of obey authority, and just they do so to kind of avoid punishment. Think of somebody who has been maybe raised in a real strict religion, and they never kind of spoke to anybody outside of that particular religion. They may have a very black and white view of the world, in the sense I just have to obey it, and if I don't, I will go to hell, or I go to a dark place. The second stage, where Kohlberg says that there's an evolution, is that you are to satisfy one's own desire and letting others do the same through fair exchanges. So he would take this as kind of like the next stage up. Think of the teenager who's starting to kind of question authority. This is, a natural progression for teenagers. So once they start kind of realizing that mom and dad don't have all the answers, and their limited insight on what mom and dad is giving them, or their church is giving them, they start to kind of question, they start to kind of rebel. And so Kohlberg would say that stage two, that you start to kind of satisfy maybe your own individual desires, and you let others do the same, but you want to make sure that there's a fair exchange, in the sense that one's not overarching the other one. After that, you go to stage three, and you cultivate one's relationships and perform the duties of one's social roles. So this is where you become more family oriented, or at least oriented in the sense of whatever your tribe or religion or school or something is you get to a point where you want to pick something, and you decide to follow it for the sake of that particular tribe. And cultivating one's relationship, this is where you start to have relationships. So this is think of who you are about 23, 24, 25, maybe you're in your 20s. You start to realize, okay, maybe I want a family. What kind of family do I want? Do I want to marry somebody or be with somebody that's of my same religious upbringing? Do I want to have someone that's a little bit more progressive, a little bit more conservative? Those are some of the questions that you start to ask. Do I want somebody that goes to my church? Do I want somebody that doesn't go to my church? So stage 3 is really where you're trying to find community within your own group. Stage 4 is that you're obeying the law and maintaining the welfare of the group. So it goes a little bit beyond that. You don't just become a member of the group. Stage 4, you become kind of a somewhat of not necessarily a protector, but you see that your contract is essential for the group's functioning. I think of what the social contract theory was all about. This is where Kohlberg would say this is social contract theory, in the sense that I'm doing things, doing ethical law, mainly to maintain the function of the group. And then stage 5, you can see it keeps getting more and more complex, upholding the basic rights and values of one's society. And then stage 6, abiding by abstract universal moral principles. In other words, you're beyond just your society, or you're beyond your own group, you're beyond your own individual understanding of the world. You're seeing your ethics as kind of like an inclusive, moral, universal principle that applies to wherever you go. So Kohlberg really kind of, it's kind of an interesting take on stages, in the sense it goes from a very somewhat egotistical, not necessarily in a negative sense, but just very self-centered view of reality, to kind of this universal view of reality. Now Kohlberg, he was kind of charged with this is where we need to kind of understand with feminist ethics. Why is he important there? Well, he felt that women really couldn't get past a particular phase. So some people would accuse him of being, quote, sexist. I don't like using those terms, sexist, racist, all this other stuff. I feel like most of these people were trying to do the best they could with the information they had in front of them. I get sometimes kind of irritated when people just kind of brush off other people in history as if they were living at that particular time, they would necessarily know any better. The likelihood of you knowing any better is probably minimal to none. So anyway, a little bit of philosophical humility here. Anyway, a little tangent there. But Kohlberg, he felt like women at that time just couldn't necessarily get past a particular ethical phase. So this is kind of what we were talking about earlier about Virginia Woolf, where she felt like women were not necessarily appreciated for their ethical gifts. And he gives an example of the Heinz theory. And the Heinz theory is about a person's wife, Heinz, who was near death, and he finds out that his pharmacist has the drug that could cure his wife from this disease. And the pharmacist then says, well, I will only give you this drug for $2,000, even though it only costs $200 to make. And so what Kohlberg said to little boys and little girls, he said, what should you do in this particular situation? Little boys, or one particular little boy in general, but many of them would say, well, you should see if you could talk the pharmacist down. If you can't, you should just steal it. In other words, the wife is the most important thing. And so Kohlberg looked at that and he said, okay, seems like he's thinking more of the good of society or good of his group. Seems like he's a little bit more advanced. What the little girl said was something very different. She said, actually, no, you shouldn't lie. In fact, you shouldn't lie because stealing in all situations is wrong. And if you stole the drug, then you would likely have to go to jail. So maybe your wife is saved for a little bit. But the problem here is you would have to go to jail and your wife would then suffer. And Kohlberg kind of looked at that and he said, okay, that's a good answer. You're a sweet little thing. But he kind of, in his mind, he wrote this down. He said, she seems to only see things in a particular phase, a stage, and that's a lower stage than some of the men who have answered the question. Now, as you can probably see, there were a lot of feminists who didn't really like what Kohlberg was saying. One in particular, by a woman named Gilligan. And Carol Gilligan wrote a book called In a Different Voice, and she saw what Kohlberg was saying, and she really questioned and grilled him on this. And she said, why is the girl's response different, or not different, but worse than the boys? How do we know that the boys' response is even better than the girls? And when we really think about what the girl's response is, it was actually a lot more advanced than we give it credit to. I mean, Kohlberg thought it was a undeveloped stage because it seemed like the girl was only wanting to avoid punishment. And yes and no. It seemed like she wasn't thinking past the problem. But Gilligan came along and said, actually, she is thinking past the problem. In fact, she might be thinking way past the problem here, because she actually brings up an excellent point, that if he were to put himself in a situation where he would lie or steal the drug, one, you don't know whether or not the drug is going to cure the wife. Two, if it does cure the wife, and she, say, for example, has to get better, and she's bedridden, and she's slowly getting well, what does that do for her if all of a sudden you now have to go to jail for 5 years or 3 years, however long it needs to be? If you break inside of a pharmacy, I would imagine. I mean, if you broke inside of a pharmacist or a pharmacist's house or a pharmacy itself, and like Walgreens after it's closed, and you break in and you go off and you steal a drug and you leave, I'm kind of thinking that might be a long prison time. I'm just thinking, maybe I'm wrong, but at least some time here. So what the girl was saying is, you shouldn't lie in that situation, because if you did do that, think of the problems that you would put, especially if you had children. So Gilligan was saying, the girl was taking things not in an impersonal black and white way like the little boy was, in the sense that he was only seeing the ethic, quote, the good of his own society. She was taking it in a very personal way. And so that's what brings in, going back to Virginia Woolf, that the female voice brings a very interesting and needed influence to ethical questions. That is the need for relationship and the need for the personal. And this is where this lecture, or the chapter, comes in pretty handy, because we've been reading a lot about all these ethical theories. And the one thing that maybe some of you are questioning, or some of you guys may be asking, is they seem a little bit impersonal to me. And that's actually a very, very good question, because they do. And they do seem a little impersonal. I mean, as much as Kant's categorical imperative is profound, in my opinion, it's still one of the most profound ethical statements in the history of philosophy. There does seem to lack in a lot of the ethical theories this sense of personal, the need for personal relationships. And so Gilligan brought in this question, why, if men and women are different, how can we not necessarily see women as this kind of subcategory, but maybe as a category that's needed for their differences? In other words, differences are essential to balance. And this is true for most religions in the world. For example, when we think of Taoism, the yin and the yang, the chaos and the order, and the black side of the yin is the yang is there's a little bit of order, and in the order side of the other yin and yang, there's a little bit of chaos. There's perfect balance. There's perfect harmony. And what she was saying is that, okay, just because we're different doesn't mean that we can't actually include much more, or that we can't supplement something to the ethical question. So, is it true that men and women think differently? Yes, and we should thrive for those. We should rejoice in those differences. What Gilligan is saying. The book then goes into why maybe some of these differences occur. It says that one explanation may be social. Women are just caring. So one of the differences that Gilligan pointed out was empathy. Women seem to be a little bit more empathetic or caring. That doesn't mean that you can't find men that are caring. So you have to stay away from a lot of absolutes. Nor does it mean that every woman that you meet is somehow empathetic or caring. I'm sure many of you have probably met women who are not necessarily empathetic, and you've met many men who are extremely empathetic, and vice versa. What she's kind of saying is this kind of general makeup of what constitutes, quote, femininity, in this sense of care, looking out for your own group, i.e., think of the mother bear. The mother bear is a perfect example that she will do anything she can protect. She will do anything that she needs to do to protect her cub, and that's either dying herself or eating you. Okay, so that for her own group, and it can be used for good, and it could, yeah. So, And so what she's saying is that this empathy is empathy for your own children, I guess you could say. And it doesn't, even if you don't necessarily have children, this empathy for your own particular group is very, very important when it comes to the quote feminine voice. Um, so why is that? I mean, I don't want to go too much into depth here about, is there such a thing versus, is it because women are taught to be that way versus are women just that way in general? I will say this though, because I teach psychology. You want to stay away from all ideologies that either say one or the other. And there is so much psychological research out there, tons and tons and tons and tons. I mean, it's piles after piles after piles that state that there are just biological differences between the sexes. There just are. So nature definitely has something to do with the genetic chromosomes. All of these things are essential. We have different hormones. We have different genes. All of these things are going to be are essential to the differences between men and women. At the same time, you can't ignore the social influence that we have in our culture. So this is what gets really, really tricky, because you have Japanese culture, for example, where the women do a lot of the male roles and some of the men do the quote female roles. And then you have African culture, certain African tribes where it's kind of intertwined. And then you have a variety of groups where you have men and women doing kind of the same thing and different things and interchangeable things. So you can't necessarily state that your society, your social influence doesn't have anything to do with it either. I'll say right here, if I could speak for the logic of the middle. I don't always like to go in the logic of the middle, but this is one of those examples where I feel like I need to. It's you have to include both. You just have to. You have to include both. And I do think that the best theory may be Charles Darwin. So we're asking the question, why does the feminine seem to be this place of empathy? And what he would say is the struggle for survival. This is where social psychology can often come in on explaining why that may be the case. When you look at social psychology, I'm sorry, not social psychology, evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology basically states that we have the survival of the fittest, and our struggle for survival constitutes that men in general have to do certain roles and women have to do certain roles, i.e. take care of their tribe, which is why over time, for us as a species to have survived all these years, this is how we can explain some of these differences. Love to get your input on that. So how is this important for implications for moral judgment? The book gives 3 examples: family and friends, children with HIV, and then animals. What you really want to see in all of it is that the effects of care are essential when we look at family and friends. That things are not done just by our sense of duty, but our sense of loyalty. Children with HIV, that's what the feminist voice, what that section is talking about, is that ethics of care, feminists didn't necessarily feel that you had to be obligated, for example, to take care of everybody outside of your group. The ethics of care of your group is the most important thing. Then you should be loyal to that as much as you possibly can, but you don't necessarily have to take care of everybody outside of it per se. You can see some strengths and weaknesses already. If you're too loyal to your group, it actually can be a closed unit in the sense that you actually decrease in empathy for people who may be outsiders, maybe outside of you, if you're too, quote, loyal to the group. But if you're too overextended, for example, and you're taking care of everybody else outside of your group and not taking care of your own group, then that could be a form of neglect. So there's a balance here. This is why feminism is very important in the sense that it brings balance, but it's neither of these voices are to be extreme. And this is where Gilligan is trying to get, we have something to say. And then finally, animals, kind of the same thing. Many feminists, or not many feminists, but some feminists would state that relationships, if relationships are the most important, empathy is the most important. You kind of eat what's in front of you as best as you can if it's important for your group. So This is just some implications. It's for ethics. Again, it's not to be taken as either this way versus that way. Don't read it like that. It's more of like, think of a yin and yang as a balance, and I think there's a much needed balance, uh, because the, there could be. I don't like to use this word male bias. I don't like to use that, but you get the point. When we only read um, ethical theories only from a particular viewpoint, we may miss certain things. And Gilligan really pointed that out brilliantly in the example of her stages of Kohlberg's. Uh, okay, so hopefully that's clear for you. And then I want to move on to chapter 12, virtue ethics. There's a lot here, but I want to really summarize. Um, so, and just what the main points are. So virtue ethics this is a good place to jump right a segue into this chapter, because virtue ethics was done by really kind of created somewhat by Aristotle, and virtue ethics saw balance and harmony and a character to be the most important things when you're propagating ethical rules. So what virtue ethics is really talking about is staying away from the extremes and trying to develop your character more so than every single like right and wrong answer to all of life. There's a danger for people who are virtue ethicists to be so rigid on rules and not on what is practical for the community and also practical on developing character. So this is a really good segue from feminism, because it's a little bit more, I guess, it clarifies certain things that feminism was trying to clarify. So what is virtue? Aristotle stated that virtue is a character, that it's a trait that's habitually manifested. So a virtue is something that you are constantly and you're in the habit of doing. In other words, for Aristotle, you can't expect for you to be an honest person just because you tell a few honest things to your partner. Let's say, for example, if you're married. Aristotle would not say that you're an honest person if your wife tells you, tell me what really happened. Say, for example, you did something you're not supposed to do, and you tell her the truth maybe 1 out of 7 times. I don't think most of us would say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean he's an honest person. I get this sometimes in my practice. It's kind of funny and sad at the same time. Somebody will be caught in something that they did that they really weren't supposed to do, and say, for example, if they've been lying and lying and lying and lying, and then they finally do kind of tell the truth about something, and then the partner's like, they believe him, but then they're like, why do you lie to me all the time? And the partner's like, what do you mean? I just told you the truth. It's just like, and I don't say this in my sessions, and I'm like pulling my hair out. I'm like, yeah, well, she's got a point. So the point is that when you look at character, it's not just like 1 or 2 times. It's a continual habit over and over and over and over again. So it's not like me patting myself in the back that I did something courageously one day. It's that I'm doing something courageously every day, and almost in every situation, I'm taking a stand, taking a risk per se. So that's a good. I like that definition. It's a very convicting kind of definition in the sense of looking at my own character. Do I continually and habitually practice these virtues every day, or do I just kind of see them as pockets? For example, that I just practice over here and then don't practice over here. I'm thinking of patience. I'm the father of 3 children, so I try. Okay, you can probably hear my baby in the background. So a vice would be something different. A vice would be a habit of doing something, that you're doing something that may not develop your character. Again, character is the most important thing. Notice that it's not necessarily right or wrong. It is, but it's more character. What makes you functional in your community, and what are the things that we should be practicing? So he gives us an example. What are some of the virtues? I won't read all of them, but it's civility, compassion, conscientiousness, justice, loyalty, thoughtfulness, tolerance, prudence, patience, self-reliance, tactfulness. So what Aristotle would say, though, and this is where virtue ethics comes in, is that you when you take these as a whole, um, and you try to develop all of these particular characteristics, you actually you stay away from extremes. So you want to be well balanced in your character. Uh, and so what Aristotle would say is that there's a problem when people just focus, for example, on courage, and that's it. They're only going to focus on courage. Well, that person may like be kind of obnoxious, for example, at like, I don't know, a dinner event. They're like, you've ever met somebody, they're like been on Facebook for way too long, and they're coming and they're like starting fights with like everybody in the whole room, and you're like, dude, it's Thanksgiving, can we just calm down? That person's like, in his eyes, he's very courageous because he kind of recognizes offense and he's like jumping on everything. Aristotle will be like, okay, yes, you're courageous, but you need to back off. You need to work on tact. You need to work on patience. You need to work on just kind of little moderation. So Aristotle would be, he would probably have a problem with like the AA model. I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for saying, I don't think I will, but AA model says, abstinence only, or you're going to be an alcoholic. Now, I'm getting way above my head, so let me kind of back up. So the AA model would be for people there are certain people who have abused alcohol where they have to never ever drink alcohol again. So I'm not talking about those people, but there's a view of alcohol that is, people would say it's an either or. Either I need to binge completely, or never ever touch it for the rest of my life. And what Aristotle would say is, okay, you're putting things in a black and white perspective, and moderation, what that includes, is having a glass of wine over a meal and really kind of tasting it. If you ever notice, alcoholics actually don't taste alcohol; they just drink it, just chug it. I remember going out to a bar once with one of my good friends, and we were just like tasting like the whiskey, and we were like, oh, that tastes so good. You could hear, we were like talking about the herbs and all this stuff. And we were with a friend, it was kind of a mutual friend. He was just kind of sitting with us, and I'm pretty sure he was an alcoholic. And we were asking him, what does your beer taste like? He was like, what do you mean? It doesn't taste like anything. That's the thing. Alcoholics actually can't taste the alcohol. They just chug it, right? And so there's extremes. There's extremes here. And so what Aristotle would say is moderation is you're really kind of calming down and just like tasting a little bit of the drink, and that's it. So you're not getting excessively drunk, nor are you a teetotaler. You just know how to relax a little bit. So what, going back, so Aristotle would say, don't just take one particular virtue and put it on steroids. You need to include all of them. And he gives some example in the books like courage, generosity, and the other one being honesty, loyalty to friends and family. You could kind of read through that, but you could obviously see, the problem with being overly generous, for example, to the point where you're not even taking care of your own family. So what the ethicists point out too, or maybe overly courageous, or overly overly honest. That's a good approach. I mean, it gives an example that how should we ever tell a lie? And the book gives us a case where an honest person will never lie or deceive, except in rare circumstances when there are compelling reasons to do so. So virtue ethics would respect people that lived during the Holocaust, for example, who told the German soldiers, when they were asked, are there any Jews in your apartment? They said, no, I don't know where they are. So it would respect that, because what is it doing? It's not taking honesty to the extreme. It's saying, look, I'm going to be honest, but lives are at stake here. I'm not telling the truth because you're going to kill them. So this is what virtue ethics comes in. Again, character is the most important thing. And two advantages of virtue ethics. One is that there's a moral motivation. What do I mean by that? Well, again, when you focus way too much on duty, are you going to be an ethical person? Well, maybe in some situations, yes. In some situations, no. So if Valentine's Day is coming up in three months, it's my worst holiday. I mean, I don't like Valentine's Day. I don't know. It's roses and chocolate, and you can't find a restaurant anywhere, and everything. I'm in a bad mood in February, and I don't know. I still like Valentine's Day. Don't tell my wife that though. She's in the other room. So Valentine's Day. Okay. So Valentine's Day, I get some roses, and I get my wife some chocolate. I do like Nichols chocolates. There's some damn good chocolates. So if all of a sudden I get my wife Nichols candies and some roses, and I'm kind of in a bad mood, say for example I am, but I actually want to give them to her. But let's say for example, if I allow my bad mood to get the best of me, and I don't really want to give them to her, and I knock on the door and I'm going to surprise her, and this is the way I'm going to look when she opens the door. And she asks me, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I got your Valentine's present, babe. She's like, oh, really? What? Oh, that's so wonderful. Where is it? And like, I hand her my roses and I hand her my chocolate. She's like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. And she's been with the kids all day. And she asks me, oh, babe, why did you do that? And I say, well, it's because of my duty. It's my duty. So I expect to be served with a good meal tonight, sweetie. Okay, what's going to happen? Am I a good husband? No. Even if I spend a lot of money on chocolate and roses, okay, I spent $300. Am I a good husband in that moment? No. No. What did I do wrong? I gave her a gift out of my duty to her, but not because I necessarily wanted to, but because I just felt obligated. Some of you probably have had friends. You ever had a friend? You're like feeling like crap, and then they call you out of duty. You're like, hey, I wanted to check up on you, and you can tell that they don't really want to talk to you. You're like, oh, yay, you're feeling crap. Your friends at the end of the line, you can tell like they're getting totally distracted. You ever been in that situation? It's really irritating because then like, why? Then you're asking, what the hell did you even freaking call me? Because then they put the onus on you. You're like, okay. Or if you're grieving, this is the worst when you're grieving and somebody says, oh, let me know if you need anything. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. I just lost my parent. I'm sure I have a lot of time to email you. Hey, I need something. Thanks for packing yourself on the back. Don't do that when people are grieving. Just do it, right? Just do it. If you want to do something for somebody, do it. If you don't. But don't say, tell me if you need anything, because you're doing that out of duty, and it puts the obligation on the person to do something for you, and they don't want to do something for you. So either you do it or don't do it. Okay. Anyway, so what virtue ethics does is that it says, hey, work on your character so you actually want to do certain things, and that's what makes you an ethical person. So what I should be doing, going back to my wife example, is knocking on the door and saying, hey, sweetie, how you doing? And actually kind of feeling happy about it. And I give her and actually just give it to her because I actually want to do it. Like I do, even though I don't love Valentine's Day, I love her smile, and I love her eating the chocolates. It's just hilarious because she eats them so slowly, and she's so happy. And if I'm thinking on that, and I actually want to give her something good, and I'm getting kind of excited, and I do something, and here, sweetie, I just want to give this to you. Which one's the more ethical example? Well, the second one, right? Even though there's not, quote, rules per se, and this is what Aristotle was saying, you could fall in love with duty all you want, but if your character is not developed, and this is why habits, you need to be telling the truth not just one or two times of the day, but like all the time. Because if you just habitually do vices, example, like if you're constantly impatient and constantly impartial or constantly dishonest, you're going to be like the first guy that's just going to do duties, pat myself on the back, and totally not be an ethical character. So, and then the second example, doubts about the ideal of impartiality. That kind of talks about what we're just stating there about the importance of character. So I think I explained enough of these two things. This is my last lecture. 13 is pretty easy. It's just the summary of the book. It's been good. I've enjoyed this class. Really have. So email me if you guys have any questions. And thanks for listening.